Okay, don't try to be fully healed. Just aim to be healed enough that your particular list of issues are not a meaningful barrier to living a life you love. My name is Pablo Das. I am trained as a Buddhist teacher and as a holistic wellness coach. I also work with people around the resolution of trauma and recovery from addiction and other things. My website is causesofwellbeing.com, and today I want to talk about the process of healing. I took my first meditation instructions 31 years ago. I was 19, and I had no idea then that I would be on a 3 decade long journey that would have a lot of different stops. I've tried a bunch of different modalities, all in the service of this elusive thing called healing. Now, as a teacher in a large Buddhist community, and now as a person who's had a long time one-on-one coaching practice, I've also had the opportunity of working with people for years at a time in their own healing process. And in my experience of the process of healing over the long term, there are basically 3 things that happen. So, you come in with your list of things, right? The things that are impacting your life, the things that you feel burdened by. You come in with your anxieties, you come in with your depression, your phobias, your interpersonal and relational stuff. You come in with your stuff around food and your addiction patterns and your traumas, and you just come in with your list of things that you would like to see be different. And there's 3 things that happen in my experience. The first thing that happens is that some of the things on your list will be resolved. You come in, you do your work, and some of the things that you're burdened by, you will no longer be burdened by. I happen to be a person who early in my adult life, I had some traumatic experiences from which I retained what in psychology would be referred to as intrusive images. So I would be visited by images from these experiences that I had, and they would be very disturbing and, dysregulate me, and they'd cause anxiety and panic attacks and that sort of thing. And in the process of actually doing my work, those images stopped intruding. I was actually completely unburdened by that experience, completely as a result of doing the trauma work that I did. So that's an example of you come in with your list, and some of the things on the list will actually be resolved. So that's one end of the spectrum. Now, on the other end of the spectrum are the things that, no matter how hard you work on them, they don't seem to want to change. It's very disappointing, but the nature of this work is such that that's just kind of how it goes. Some of the things just seem to be kind of so deeply conditioned or so baked in that they just kind of seem to be part of who you are. The old spiritual teacher Ram Dass talked about this, and he would say, in all the years of doing all of the spiritual healing work that he did, he said there were these neuroses that just never left, and so he just started to refer to them as his style. So on this end of the spectrum, there are these things that don't seem to change, but what changes is your relationship to them. This is actually very Buddhist in a way. So you change your relationship to them. You've come at these things from every angle. You've done work maybe for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. In my case, 30 years. You're engaged in this work of trying to heal certain parts of yourself. And at some point, you just kind of realize they're not going to budge. And then there's a shift, almost out of necessity, in your relationship to these things. You start to kind of accept them. Actually, one of the things that happens that's very liberating is that because you've done the work, and because you've seen that they're just sort of there, that they are what they are, that you also stop apologizing about them. You stop feeling shame about the limitations that you carry. And in a way, there's a way in which you stop perhaps even as a result of the acceptance, you stop behaving in ways that make things worse. So that's kind of this other end of the spectrum. There are the things that totally go away, that get resolved. There are the things that don't seem to change, but you change your relationship to them. You change your behavioral responses to them in a way that you're not always making things worse. You stop apologizing about your limitations. You stop experiencing shame. And that's all very healthy and that's meaningful progress. So there are these two poles, and then in between is this other area where there are some things that you do your work and they don't seem exactly to resolve, but they change in ways that you can track. And this is something that in my one-on-one work with people, I'm always paying attention to. So there may be something that changes that doesn't change so much, but it changes in particular ways. So for example, you might have an experience that persists, but it changes in terms of the frequency with which it shows up. And this is a very big deal. You may have there may be a certain set of conditions. I mean, it's always easy to use anxiety as an example of this, where you may have some set of conditions. Maybe there's let's use the family setting, right? You go home to your family of origin, and you have some experience there that provokes some sort of anxiety or depressive state, right? But you start to notice that as you do the work, that kind of thing happens less frequently for any number of reasons. And then you also notice that it may continue to arise, but the duration of the experience is much less. Or you start to notice that the intensity of the experience is much less. Something that would take you out for a couple of days or even weeks. In some cases, people come in and they're destabilized in ways that last for months. And then you start to do your work and you start to gain some insight and you start to develop some skill sets, and some of the things in the trauma work or the recovery work really start, or the contemplative work really start to take hold. And you just notice that there are these changes in frequency, duration, and intensity. And there's another thing that I like to track, which is complexity. There are ways in which some of the things that we come in burdened with, when they arise, they trigger a kind of cascade effect into other experiences. So like some experience that might provoke anxiety might then be followed by behavioral behaviors that compound your suffering. So anxiety arises, and then there's an addiction pattern, and then because the addiction pattern is back, then there's negative self-talk and shame, and because there's negative self-talk and shame, there might be withdrawal or isolation patterns, and then from that, depression because of disconnection. And there's this way in which these things one thing can arise and can have a kind of domino effect in ways that it sort of just kind of makes things so much more complicated. Another thing that tends to happen, especially with people who have a trauma history, is that there's a kind of coupling of one trauma arises and it triggers another trauma, and then that thing triggers another thing. And there's a way in which one thing arises and then a whole bunch of other things arise. So one of the things I look for is a decrease in that kind of complexity, that we start to see that something can arise and it can just be there on its own without the kind of complexity that makes it so overwhelming to deal with. So that's the kind of way that I see the process. You have some things that are resolved, some things that don't seem to really budge, but you change your relationship to them, you change your behavioral responses to them, you're no longer ashamed, you stop apologizing, and then there's a space in the middle where you can kind of track particular changes with things in terms of frequency, in terms of duration, in terms of intensity, complexity. And so you are not, in fact, totally healed. But because of all of this work and all of the changes in all those particular ways, you end up in a very different place. And the place that I'm always aiming to support people to get to, as I said in the beginning, is not to be totally healed. It's just to be healed enough that your particular list of issues are no longer a barrier to living a life that you love. So that's the way that I experience healing. I'm going to stop there. If you're interested in one-on-one support, my website is Causes of Wellbeing. You can go to the coaching tab, and there's any number of ways, the contact tab as well, that you can reach out, and I can see if I'm the right person to support you in your process. And if you're willing, especially at this early stage, to subscribe to particularly YouTube, or there may be a Substack and a podcast in the very near future. I'm kind of working out all of that. It would be meaningful to me to have that kind of affirmation that people are interested in and wanting to see what happens next. Okay, thank you very much. Be well. I'll see you in the next video.